Hello, darlings, and welcome back to the series where I rank every 360-era shooter I can get my hands on. While I had originally planned to get out 2 episodes of this series for October, focusing on 6 horror shooters, life had other plans for me, so I'll only get to 1. All that having been said, let's get this intro out of the way and just move right on to the first game we're looking at today, Shellshock 2: Blood Trails. Shellshock 2: Blood Trails is, on the surface, one of the worst games I've played for this series. And make no mistake, this is a bad game, but it's also one with an interesting enough premise and such an odd, fascinating execution that it's almost worth a look. A Vietnam-era war shooter, Blood Trails' saving grace is its unique approach to the subject matter, imbuing it with horror. Instead of non-stop bombast and slow-mo like most Call of Duty likes of its day, Blood Trails tries to slow down the action and put players in a hellish experience more in line with Condemned, except with zombies. Yeah, like I said, it's interesting, just not very good, but we'll get to that. The game's atmosphere work is absolutely top-notch, and does a good job of setting and maintaining an appropriately horrific tone. Seeing dismembered soldiers and blood-stained walls and hallways are no new fare for horror games, but seeing it in such an otherwise typical military shooter setting is an interesting spin on a well-worn formula. There are also some really interesting environmental choices that help aid the atmosphere and spice up an otherwise humdrum level selection. A personal highlight is a crumbling mansion filled with zombies that plays like Resident Evil by way of Apocalypse Now. Traps laid out in the jungle sections, which can deliver a swift death if not properly avoided, help to take advantage of the setting to heighten tension. And little touches like a screaming baby juxtaposed against distant explosions and silence in the game's opening level paint a picture of a team with a solid vision of how to unsettle a player in a military setting. Unfortunately, the atmosphere is the best aspect of the game's presentation. While there is good lighting, the textures throughout are drab and lack detail. The character models in particular make the game feel like it's an up-res PS2 era title with blocky, angular faces and janky animations. The game's color palette is the expected mix of dull grays and browns, broken up by green foliage and red blood splatters. There's nothing to write home about here. If there's a second draw, it's the game's story. Well, more the concept of the story, which is pretty fresh, than the actual story that gets told. Up front, the game drops you into the shoes of a GI whose brother has been infected as part of a secret experiment conducted by the army in Vietnam. Your brother is sought by the Viet Cong, who are looking to stop an outbreak of the infection he carries, called White Night. It's an opening sequence with some half-decent narration and sets a nice tense tone, but it's a tone the pacing of the game just isn't paired to deliver on. Each level is a short, incredibly linear affair, and most of them are padded for length with stationary enemy encounters, turret sections, and making you slog through loads of high-damage enemies. The story is told in first-person cutscenes as you try to find your brother, I think. After a while, it's easy to lose what little plot there is. I mean, blood and guts and zombies are good, I guess, but I need some more stimulation. After an hour or so, I was ready to put this game down if it didn't give me something a little more. There are a handful of interesting ideas, like a Playboy Bunny-esque character who's kind of a murder-hungry psychopath, but the execution is uneven and tonally jarring. She's brutally killed before the player's eyes like 5 minutes after she's introduced, so what was the point of her existence aside from throwing a quick pair of tits in the player's face? And look, I love a good boob as much as the next person, but I like to have some semblance of purpose, or at least stick around. Oh, wait. What am I saying? She comes back an hour later as a sexy ghost. Other complaints about the narrative include the zombies. While the game tries to not so subtly hint that there are zombie-like creatures roaming about, it tries to maintain an air of mystery, well, until an hour when it becomes very clear that this is a zombie horror game. The problem is that the big reveal is basically a quick-time event that plays out like dozens of others in-game, and that's it. And then you don't see another zombie for like 20 minutes. It just feels like these moments were meant to be more polished, take place further into the game, and not feel like they were picked up from somewhere else in the development studio and plopped wherever they could fit the assets and animations. When viewed as a whole, it just feels unfinished. Much like the atmosphere and environments, it feels like there was a solid plan for the characters and story, but much of it had to be carved away at some point. The result is a game that can be laughable and cheesy, but also feel genuinely inspired in some spots. The aforementioned atmosphere, as well as some solid protagonist narration throughout, and a handful of horror moments I don't want to spoil, all stand out. More than any game that has actually tried to emulate cheesy midnight grindhouse horror flicks, For these reasons, Shellshock 2 actually manages to feel like one. But then there's the gameplay. The biggest problem throughout Shellshock is the inconsistent frame rate, which feels like it's constantly hanging around 30 but could fall at any moment without warning. The lack of smoothness here isn't helped by the gunplay, which can feel overly sensitive and jerky when aiming down sights, and occasionally sluggish when aiming from the hip. Thankfully, the aim down sights mechanics aren't particularly useful or necessary. If that's not enough to give you motion sickness, Shellshock 2 also has one of the hands down worst running animations I've ever seen, where your character seizes up like a teenager in 2003 moshing to a drowning pool song. And all of that is just the moving around. Shellshock 2 features a paltry weapon selection and the bizarre choice to only allow one primary weapon at a time and a sidearm. You will be using an AK-47 or an M16 for most of the game, with shotguns and RPGs reserved for certain sequences. Ammo is occasionally sparse but never completely missing, so while it's an inconvenience, I'll chalk that one up to the designers enforcing a sense of tension through gameplay for the horror theme. The weapon sounds range from surprisingly crunchy and satisfying to, well, your knife, which has all the impact of a dinner fork being gently set on the plate like a fancy little lad who's finished with supper. The game is also fraught with quick-time events throughout. While I'm okay with the aforementioned jungle traps requiring quick button presses, as it actually feels like you're avoiding an unexpected and sudden obstacle, there are first-person fight scenes that just play like dialing a phone number with 3 buttons displayed at a time. They also play the same for the Viet Cong enemies and zombies, which is fine, but the brutal and gory kill animations feel a bit gross when done on both human and dehumanized enemies. Then there's the AI. The AI is honestly just embarrassing. It alternates between running straight at the player in lines of multiple enemies and competently hiding behind cover, but sometimes also stops working properly altogether. This is a bummer because the way the encounters are set up actually have a lot of room for creating tension, with long sightlines and plenty of objects obscuring players' view, like dense foliage and debris. However, any tension here is undercut by the frustration of overwhelming odds you often face when the game throws battalions of enemies at you at a time. The overwhelming odds also occur with zombie encounters, which can lead to getting overwhelmed from all sides and a quick death. For most regular enemies, distance doesn't seem to change their accuracy, meaning in some of the busier scenes you will take tons of damage from enemies you can't see or aren't even facing. Again, with more work on the AI and encounter design, this could have been an interesting way to translate military action into tense horror, but like almost everything else in the game, it falls flat in the attempt. And the friendly AI is somehow the worst of the bunch, and will commonly see entire groups of allies, who are supposed to help fight alongside you, quickly die and leave you taking on hordes of enemies alone. Zombie AI is expectedly pretty bad, and sometimes the pathfinding in large groups breaks, which leaves them wandering in clumps waiting to be picked off like fish in a barrel. But when they aren't losing themselves in small environments, they do feel genuinely threatening, with a variety of animations that can see them break from a menacing saunter into a full-on Olympic sprint. And again, they can lead to a plethora of frustrating deaths, but the fact that they feel genuinely threatening in groups of 2 or 3, let alone 4 or 5, makes the game feel legitimately tense in some spots. I will say that the game also has a nice balance of blood and gore, making pulling the trigger feel impactful even if much of the gameplay feels lacking. The crunchy head explosions and gibs that accompany doming zombies with a shotgun is a goofy treat that never gets old. Which I think is fitting for the game overall. This is a goofy, weird, awkward game where as much of it works as it doesn't. Shellshock 2 is a game that's unique in its concept but not in its execution. How much that uniqueness matters is personal and will carry some players farther than others. In my estimation, there's no shortage of lackluster FPS games that feel half-baked from this era. But I can only think of one Vietnam zombie military shooter with a dedicated emphasis on horror, which makes Shellshock 2 a game that's hard not to recommend, even with its many, many, many flaws. By no means is it a good game, and in some places it's downright miserable, but it's also a quick sit filled with gore and zombies, and in the Halloween season, sometimes that's all you need. Fear 3's placement on this list might be contentious, but given that I just played through it for the developer documentary I made, which you should absolutely check out if you haven't, and I had all this footage lying around, I figured the spooky month was the best time for it. If you haven't seen, I recently made an hour-plus documentary on the tumultuous development of Fear 3. For the doc, I interviewed 7 members of the game's development team and showed off over 100 pieces of never-before-seen concept art of Fear 3 throughout its development. So it's safe to say at this point, having spent literally dozens and dozens of hours playing the game, poring over concept art, and assembling such a massive undertaking, I'm pretty familiar with Fear 3. But I still feel the same way I did when I first played it almost a decade ago. Fear 3 is a really good shooter, while not a great Fear game. Developed by Day One Studios and taking place after Monolith's Fear 2, Fear 3 ostensibly picks up the story of the first Fear game's protagonist as they fight alongside their ghost brother, the first Fear game's antagonist, to reach their mother, a psychic demon ghost made flesh, and prevent her from giving birth to the apocalypse. If that sounds like a lot to take in, don't worry, I won't overload you with any more story details because it's honestly not a great narrative, even by the admittedly low standard of this particular era of shooters. Side note, have you noticed that none of the games we've played for this series so far have had good stories? Because I sure have. It's a shame because knowing what went wrong in development and what things were changed and cut throughout, I can see the shadows of what Fear 3 and its story could have been. Focusing more on the brothers and their bond in a co-op format was a really smart idea, but the execution is so muddled and is let down by poor pacing that can never properly choose when to kick in the adrenaline or slow down for a minute. Aside from the lame story, Fear 3 feels great to play. The shooting is tight and responsive, and the weapon feedback is great. Limbs and blood fly as freely as prior entries, and you can still use a shotgun to turn enemies into clouds of red mist. The series' trademark slow-mo mechanics and lethal melee moves also return, and are no worse for wear. Running up to goons and popping them right in the head, or delicately popping off multiple headshot kills while using slow-mo is as satisfying as ever. But the game has a few changes to the formula, namely the co-op and cover system. The game allows you to play as Point Man in single player and unlocks the Ghostly Fettle for a second playthrough, or allows players to pick in co-op. The differences in gameplay make for a fun co-op experience, with Fettle's unique ability to possess enemies being a particular standout, but even in single player the gameplay is fun enough. The cover system is different. You pop and stop like a Gear-style third-person system, but everything plays out in first person. It's not bad and is actually quite polished, allowing players to click in and out intuitively, but it also just kind of feels unnecessary, which can be said for a few other Fear 3 editions, namely the arcade-like scoring system. As you perform feats level to level and find collectibles, you accrue points that go towards an overall score. In increments, the score gives gameplay bonuses like increased slow-mo time, etc. It's an interesting RPG system that adds replay value as the points carry over between playthroughs. In co-op, it also changes the ending based on which son performs better, pitting the two against each other in a spectacular double dragon-esque twist. But it also doesn't feel like anything from a horror game. In fact, most of Fear 3 lacks a feeling of horror and tension. One of Fear 3's many high points are the environments, which are varied and offer plenty of variety in visuals, tactical options, and enemy encounters. A few in particular stand out among FPS games, my favorite being the big box store that plays like a Costco post-apocalypse haunted house and features the best horror moments and moments of tension in the whole game. Other standouts include a mech battle on a winding Seattle area bridge and trekking through suburban apartment complexes that feel pulled straight from my childhood in the urban Pacific Northwest. But aside from a few jump scares, Fear 3 isn't so much a horror game as it is an action romp with lots of spooky things to look at. But honestly, I find it hard to hold that against the game when the moment-to-moment action is so fluid and satisfying. It's far from a perfect shooter and understandably falls short of the glory of the first title and the Fear name in general, but Fear 3 is still an above-average shooter with plenty of neat ideas. Even if they don't always come together, it nails the most important aspects of an FPS with style, and I think that's certainly important. Clive Barker's Jericho is a silly, stupid, wonderfully artistic little game. Made in the shadow of mid-2000s nu metal and post-Matrix definitions of cool, it now stands as a fascinating time capsule of nearly every bad idea the aughts contributed to character and story design. Jericho puts you in charge of the titular Jericho Squad, a team of occult warfare special ops investigating bizarre happenings in the Middle Eastern desert. As explained by a very strange voice clip that sounds straight out of Soul Calibur.
An ancient city emerged from the sands of time. bringing with it the seed of all evil.
An ancient city, Alkali, has emerged from the sands, and that probably means some other bad stuff is going to happen too. The operatives all hail from different backgrounds and specialize in a different field of occult warfare. How this manifests in the game, which is a squad-based shooter, is that you take control of team members one at a time to suit an individual tactical situation. Each character features a unique set of weapons and abilities, giving the gameplay a somewhat familiar Overwatch vibe, where you pick the character who best suits what's needed instead of just the character with the gun you like most. The campaign also splits the team up from time to time, which nicely allows for a bit of enforced gameplay variety instead of letting players grow too comfortable. The team's design clumsily walks a line between so goofy it's rad and good lord, what was anyone thinking in the 2000s? Father Rawlings, for example, is a 2-handgun-toting southern minister with a full-body leather pastoral gown and sports a fantastic mustache, which is not only very stupid, but also kind of cool. Some other characters, however, feel ridiculously of the time they were made, including the large Hispanic character who is always cracking wise and swearing in Spanish, and the white girl hacker sporting vivid blonde dreadlocks. If she's not your type though, Jericho has 2 other varieties of goth dream girl on offer. The Blood Witch, who wields a katana and have massive cutouts on the side of her boobs, which cannot be comfortable. And of course, full boob physics to complete the display. Alternatively, there's the short-haired lesbian sniper. You know she's a lesbian because in the first 5 minutes, the aforementioned Hispanic character jokes about her helping the aforementioned second goth girl get sand out of her ass. So, chalk one up for representation, I guess. It's a bummer there are so many goofy missteps because there are some really interesting character designs and powers, like the Blood Witch who can trap enemies with a sacrifice and the Big Bruiser who carries a fire snake in an arm-mounted black obelisk. The whole game is silly and riddled with testosterone-fueled gung-ho military cliches, but ultimately you won't notice after a bit because the cheesy voice lines and cringeworthy deliveries quickly blend together until it doesn't even stand out as bad anymore. It's almost charming in a way. I'm honestly not sure what part of this the acclaimed writer and award-winning author Clive Barker was involved with, but it sure as shit wasn't the script. After the initial level sees the main character die, and his soul able to be transferred between bodies, Jericho really picks up the pace. Players roll through Clive Barker-infused alternate versions of battles and kingdoms that have taken place in Alkali before, including World War II, Ancient Rome, and the Crusades. One of the biggest draws to the game is the environmental variety. While the game only comes in 3 colors, gray concrete, sand brown, and blood red, the way it depicts twisted Hellraiser-ish alternate timeline pocket dimensions is fascinating, and often keeps you wanting to see what's next. One of the best things I find about horror as a visual medium, especially within games, is being able to see and examine things in a realistic space that helps to give them scale. Jericho has no shortage of grotesque things to see and examine, like a barbed wire wrapped art gallery. The art design is truly worth the price of admission alone, especially for horror fans. I especially like the demented World War II sections, which play like a generic shooter got dipped in Silent Hill, and the creatively barbaric Roman Empire-themed stages. But within the environments is also the game's biggest weakness. Jericho is simply too linear for its gameplay. There are only a few larger areas throughout the game, but most of Jericho can be generously called a series of hallways. Enemy designs do an admirable job of varying tactical approaches, but they fall back on too many cliches and don't blend enemy waves up enough. You'll be fighting blended waves of melee attackers, long-range attackers, exploding enemies, and more, but with such a menagerie, the game should take more advantage and blend the challenging enemies in more than it does. Too many encounters simply consist of frustratingly navigating instant death exploding enemies and groups that rush you with reckless abandon, with the frustration exacerbated by restrictive surroundings. The game tries to keep players engaged with the aforementioned switching of characters, but at the end of the day the environments lack variety that keep anything from getting stale, and more importantly, that would have taken better advantage of the squad mechanics and unique abilities of the team. Similarly, the squad mechanics themselves are pretty bare bones, and basically amount to telling team members where to go or when to dig in. It doesn't help that within the linear environments, the team's navigation abilities often leave much to be desired. They consistently walk into walls of enemy fire, devolving shootouts into intense sessions of babysitting the AI and reviving whoever goes down when you can. I can't help but salivate at the encounter designs that would have been possible with more open-ended combat arena design, akin to something like Halo. Being able to position and set up a sniper, then switch to a heavy for suppressing fire, and then to a melee character, and then just letting the battle play out. Alternately, Jericho has all the pieces for an incredible co-op experience, and came out in the golden age of co-op shooters no less. Or, if the game had simply opted to be a fast-paced, retro-style shoot-'em-up and had dropped the squad mechanics and frustrating enemy designs altogether. There are moments of fast-paced action and brilliance in the design that make me wonder what could have been if the game strayed a little bit more from the conventions of the day, but Jericho's various pieces are simply mismatched. It's definitely a level of innovation that a sequel could have seen, and it's a real shame because aside from the rote encounter design and linearity, Jericho isn't half bad as a shooter. The gunplay itself is satisfying, with each character having a main and alternate weapon that are varied and complement each gameplay style well. Headshots are deliciously crunchy, enemy gibs are reminiscent of classic Quake in the best way, and weapon sounds have a nice heft. My personal favorite conjunction of these elements comes with Black, the lesbian sniper, and her magic bullet ability, which fires a slow-mo guided round that can bust through heads and pierce up to 3 enemies in showers of strung-together gore. It's a simple pleasure, but it never gets old. Visually, the game is a mixed bag, mostly because the already mentioned bland color palette, which is too bad because the rest of the game is still gorgeous, at least when you can see it. The game's art design shines through the murk, but Jericho is one of those games that feels the need to make everything a bit too dark to force players to use their flashlights. I can understand a lonely game like Doom 3 doing this, but there's not a whole lot of tension to go around in a game like this, where you're always at least with 2 other psychic badasses wielding a variety of cutting-edge weaponry, so the constant darkness just feels unnecessary. Other than that, Jericho has aged really well. Textures are crisp, animations are smooth and varied, and there's an abundance of quality lighting effects throughout. It's also nice to see a mediocre shooter from that era that used bloom effects without just blowing the whole image to shit. Oh, and Jericho has some of the best wet-looking textures I've ever seen. I don't know what kind of shader they used, but every bloody carcass or wall of rotting flesh has this pixelated sheen to it that just still looks fantastic. And speaking of looking fantastic, Jericho has a gallery of absolutely fantastic monster designs from start to finish. From the fleshy barbed wire wrapped cultists to flayed flying demons, centurions with skin for shields, and even skeleton medieval crusaders. My personal favorites, however, are the truly creative and grotesque monsters like the spiky behemoth, a repeated boss type that is more bark than bite. Another great design are for the child crusaders who float around the area in ghostly forms before turning fleshy and swarming the team, whipping them with long tendrils that have replaced their arms. And finally, the gladiator, a hulking creature that is a perfectly fun combination of Clive Barker's aesthetics and the game's goofy tone. It's regrettable that Jericho has as much going for it as it does against it. The poor AI, lackluster combat design, overly linear levels, and ridiculous story undermine what is otherwise a gorgeously artistic and satisfying shooter. It's a hard game to fully recommend, but it's one I still have a soft spot for and occasionally shows real brilliance. Alrighty everybody, and that brings us to the end of the episode as usual. Again, very sorry for only getting one of these episodes out this month when I planned on 2, but let me know what you think if you've played these games before, and of course if you have any suggestions for games I should cover in the future. That having been said, I have a couple more videos coming soon, so please stay tuned, like and subscribe, and share if you can.